Deep in the rain-soaked foothills of the Cascade Mountains, where ancient Douglas firs stood like sentinels against the bruised October sky, Lyra Winters made a discovery that would shatter everything she thought she understood about the world. The storm had been building for 3 days. Not the gentle Pacific Northwest drizzle that locals wore like a second skin, but something older, more primal. The kind of tempest that made even the ravens abandon their roosts and seek shelter in the hollows of rotting stumps. The wind howled through the canyon with a voice that sounded almost human, almost anguished, carrying with it the scent of ozone and wet stone, and something else, something wild. Lyra had been staying at her Aunt Vivian's cabin for 6 days. The place sat on the ragged edge of Oak Haven, an unincorporated community so small it barely registered on state maps. Just a scatter of weathered houses clinging to the mountainside, connected by logging roads that turned to rivers of mud every autumn. The cabin itself was a sturdy A-frame built in the 70s, all rough-hewn timber and stone, perched on a ridge overlooking a canyon the locals called Devil's Drop. She stood now on the cabin's covered porch, watching sheets of rain sweep across the valley below. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 42 degrees, cold enough to see her breath. Cold enough that the rain occasionally turned to sleet that clicked against the metal roof like skeletal fingers. At 28, Lyra Winters had learned to find comfort in solitude. She was tall and lean-built like a long-distance runner, with the kind of quiet watchfulness that came from spending more time with maps than people. Her dark hair, usually pulled back in a practical braid, was already damp from the mist that crept under the porch overhang. Her hands, scarred from years of fieldwork, cradled a steaming mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Seattle, where she rented a cramped studio apartment, felt like another world. A world of noise and light and the suffocating press of other people's lives. She'd fled that world 6 days ago with nothing but a backpack, her surveying equipment, and a hollowness in her chest that had been growing for years. The loneliness wasn't new. It had been her constant companion since she was 16 years old. Lyra closed her eyes, letting the sound of the rain wash over her. But the memories came anyway. They always did when she stood still too long. 12 years ago, on a Tuesday morning in late September, her father had left for what should have been a routine surveying job. Robert Winters had been a land surveyor for the Oregon Department of Forestry, a methodical man who approached the wilderness with the reverence of a scholar studying ancient texts. He mapped the unmappable, charted the wild places where the forest still held secrets. Devil's Drop had been one of his regular survey sites, a jagged ravine 3.2 miles from Vivian's cabin, accessible only by a narrow trail that switched back down through old-growth timber. The official report said he'd slipped on wet rocks, a tragic accident, a fall of approximately 40 feet onto granite outcrop. Death had been instantaneous. Lyra had been 16, old enough to understand death but too young to understand the gaping wound it would leave. Her mother, Jennifer, had barely made it through the funeral before she started dating again. Within 11 months, she'd remarried a timber company executive named Douglas Chen, who owned a house in Lake Oswego with a view of the mountains Robert had died in. Lyra's older sister, Wren, had been 20 at the time. Beautiful, practical Wren, who'd always been their mother's favorite, who'd inherited Jennifer's ability to move forward without looking back. Wren had sided with their mother, had stood in the kitchen of their childhood home and told 17-year-old Lyra to stop being morbid, to stop obsessing over Dad's death, to let it go. That had been the beginning of the end. Over the next few years, the distance between them had grown from a crack to a chasm. 5 years ago, after one too many arguments about their mother's choices and Lyra's refusal to attend family gatherings at Douglas Chen's perfect house, Wren had made it official. A terse email that boiled down to, "I can't do this anymore. Don't contact me." And Lyra hadn't. She'd poured herself into her work instead. Wilderness cartography, a profession that required more stubbornness than formal education. She'd learned surveying from her father's old field notes, taught herself meteorology from library books and online forums, and spent every spare dollar on equipment. Handheld GPS units, theodolites, weather monitoring stations she built from salvaged parts. Her studio apartment in Seattle looked less like a home and more like a research station, every wall covered with topographic maps she'd drafted by hand. The isolation suited her, or at least that's what she told herself on the nights when the loneliness became a physical ache. Aunt Vivian was the only family member who still spoke to her. Vivian Winters, her father's older sister, a woman of 68 with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to see through walls. Vivian ran a flower shop in Eugene called The Gilded Petal. To Lyra, Aunt Vivian was just eccentric, the kind of woman who grew strange medicinal plants in her greenhouse and knew the Latin names for every moss and lichen in the Cascades. What Lyra didn't know was that Vivian kept secrets, The kind of secrets that connected the ordinary world to something far older and more dangerous. But those secrets had stayed buried for 12 years, until today. When Lyra had called 6 days ago, voice tight with the kind of loneliness that made breathing hurt, Vivian hadn't asked questions. "Come to the cabin," she'd said. "I'm in Eugene for the week handling inventory. The place is yours. Take as long as you need." So Lyra had come, and for 6 days she'd done nothing but hike and map and try to outrun the emptiness. This morning the rain had slowed to a persistent drizzle. Lyra had been going stir-crazy, trapped inside by the weather, her fingers itching for work. She grabbed her heavy wax canvas jacket, the one her father had given her for her 15th birthday, now patched and worn, but still waterproof. She'd packed her surveying kit, a thermos of coffee, and the hand-drawn map she'd been working on for 3 years. The map was her obsession, a detailed topographic chart of the Cascade foothills covering roughly 200 square miles. Every ridge, every creek bed, every game trail meticulously documented. She'd been adding to it whenever she visited Aunt Vivian, cross-referencing her field measurements with weather data. She pulled from NOAA radio broadcasts. It was more accurate than the USGS maps, and it was hers. She'd planned to survey the western ridge today, but standing on the porch, studying the sky, she'd felt something shift. The wind had changed direction, swinging from southwest to northwest. The temperature had dropped 3 degrees in the last hour. Her homemade barometer showed pressure falling fast. "Storms intensifying," she'd murmured to herself, a habit picked up from years of working alone. "Coming from the northwest, 40 minutes, maybe 50, before visibility hits zero." The smart thing would have been to stay inside, but Lyra had stopped doing smart things the day she'd decided to make a career out of wandering the wilderness with antiquated surveying equipment. Besides, it was Tuesday. For 3 years, every time she visited the cabin, she'd hike to Devil's Drop on Tuesday mornings. A ritual, a pilgrimage. The place where her father had died, where his blood had soaked into the moss-covered granite, where his last breath had fogged in the mountain air. She told herself it was about maintaining the trail, about keeping that section of her map updated. But deep down, she knew the truth. She went because it was the only place she still felt connected to him, the only place where the loneliness receded just a little. So she'd shouldered her pack and set out. The trail to Devil's Drop started as an old logging road barely wide enough for a single vehicle, choked with alder saplings and blackberry vines. After a mile, it narrowed to a footpath that wound through stands of old-growth Douglas fir, their trunks so thick 3 people couldn't link hands around them. The canopy blocked most of the rain, but water still dripped from the branches overhead, a constant percussion that echoed through the forest. Lyra moved with the easy, efficient pace of someone who'd spent half her life in the backcountry. Her boots, expensive Danners she'd saved 6 months to buy, found purchase on slick roots and stone. She barely needed to look at the trail. She'd walked it so many times she could navigate by feel, by the particular slant of the slope, by the lightning-scarred hemlock that marked the 1-mile point. The air smelled intensely of wet earth and decomposing leaves, that rich, almost sweet scent of the Pacific Northwest in autumn. Somewhere above, a Steller's jay screamed a warning, its harsh voice cutting through the hush of falling rain. Lyra checked her watch, 7:42 a.m. She'd left the cabin at 7:15, right on schedule. Devil's Drop was approximately 3.2 miles from the cabin door, a hike that took her about an hour and 10 minutes at her normal pace. She'd be there by 8:30, could spend 40 minutes surveying the ravine's north face, and be back to the cabin by 11, well before the storm hit full force. She pulled out her handheld GPS unit, cross-checking her position against the map folded in a waterproof case on her chest. The technology and the paper agreed. She was exactly where she should be, following the path her father had walked 1,000 times. The trail began to descend more steeply. This was the tricky section where heavy rains had carved gullies across the path, exposing roots that grabbed at ankles. Lyra slowed, placing each foot with care. The last thing she needed was a twisted ankle 3 miles from help. Through the trees ahead, she could hear it, the sound that had haunted her dreams for 12 years. Not the cheerful babble of a mountain stream, but something deeper, more ominous. The roar of water plunging over the edge of Devil's Drop, falling 80 feet to the ravine floor below. The canyon appeared suddenly, the way wild places often do. One moment she was enclosed by forest, and the next the land simply fell away. Devil's Drop was a geological anomaly, a place where 2 fault lines intersected, creating a sheer-walled chasm nearly a quarter-mile long and 200 feet wide at its widest point. The waterfall that gave the place its name tumbled from the western rim, fed by a creek that swelled to a torrent every autumn. Lyra stood at the edge, one hand on a hemlock trunk for balance, and looked down. 80 feet below, the ravine floor was a chaos of massive boulders, some the size of trucks jumbled together like the toys of a careless god. Moss covered everything, thick and impossibly green even in the gray light. A few stunted cedars clung to cracks in the stone, their roots searching for purchase in a landscape that wanted nothing to do with life. This was where they'd found him, her father. Crumpled at the base of the western wall, his surveying equipment scattered around him, his neck broken so cleanly, the medical examiner had said he wouldn't have felt anything. Lyra closed her eyes, breathing through the familiar wave of grief. 12 years. It should have gotten easier. It hadn't. She was about to turn away to head north along the rim toward the survey point she'd planned to check when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not the rush of water or the whisper of wind through the firs. This was something else. A low, resonant thrumming, almost subsonic, vibrating through the soles of her boots. And beneath it, the unmistakable metallic clink and drag of something heavy scraping against stone. Lyra froze. Her heart kicked into a higher gear, that ancient prey animal response to something fundamentally wrong. She turned her head, slowly scanning the ravine. Nothing moved. The sound came again. Clink. Drag. A pause. Then a low guttural rumble that raised every hair on the back of her neck. It was coming from below. From the ravine floor. A sane person would have turned around. Would have hiked back to the cabin, locked the doors, and called the county sheriff's department. But Lyra had spent 12 years asking questions nobody wanted to answer about her father's death. Sanity and self-preservation had long since taken a backseat to the need to know. She moved along the rim, searching for the game trail she knew descended into the ravine. It was barely visible, more of a suggestion than an actual path used by deer and elk when they needed to reach the creek below. Lyra had been down it exactly 3 times in 3 years. Each time had felt like descending into a cathedral, a place too sacred and too terrible for human feet. The trail switched back down the eastern wall steep enough that she had to use tree roots as handholds. Rain had turned the path to mud that sucked at her boots. She descended carefully, testing each foothold, her breath coming shorter as the walls of the ravine rose around her. The sound grew louder, that rhythmic clink and drag, and now she could hear breathing. Heavy, labored, with a wet quality that spoke of pain. Lyra's hand went to the bear spray clipped to her belt. She never actually used it, had always figured the noise she made hiking was enough to scare off any black bears in the area. But whatever was making that sound, it was big, and it was hurt. The ravine floor was slick with moss and decades of fallen leaves. The light barely penetrated this, deep filtered through the canopy and the overhanging walls until everything took on a greenish underwater quality. The temperature had dropped at least 5 degrees. Lyra could see her breath now ghosting in the damp air. She rounded a massive boulder, stepping carefully over exposed roots, and stopped dead. 50 feet ahead, huddled against the base of an enormous oak tree, was the largest wolf Lyra had ever seen outside of a wildlife documentary. No, not just large. Impossible. The animal was easily the size of a pony, its massive head resting heavily on paws that could have belonged to a grizzly bear. Its fur was midnight black, so dark it seemed to absorb the already dim light. Even from this distance, Lyra could see the powerful musculature beneath the coat, the kind of raw physical power that belonged to an apex predator. But it was the restraints that made the scene cross from strange into surreal. The wolf wasn't caught in a hunter's trap, it was bound. Heavy chains thick as a man's thumb wound tightly around its body. Not rusted iron or steel. These gleamed with a strange, almost luminescent whitish sheen even in the dim forest light. Silver. Pure silver chains wrapped around the wolf's muzzle, its throat, its powerful chest anchored to the thick gnarled roots of the lightning-scarred oak. Where the metal touched the wolf's fur, the skin beneath looked raw and angry as if burned. Steam rose from the contact points, a thin haze that should have been impossible in the cold air. Lyra's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Silver chains. Expensive didn't begin to cover it. Pure silver at current market prices ran around $24 per troy ounce. These chains had to weigh at least 30 pounds. That was over $6,000 in raw material, not counting the craftsmanship needed to forge them. Nobody used silver for animal traps. Nobody. It made no economic sense. Steel was stronger, cheaper, more practical. Which meant this wasn't about practicality. This was ritual. This was intentional. The wolf lifted its head slowly, sensing her presence, even though she'd made no sound. The movement seemed to cost it everything. A low, rumbling growl emanated from deep in its chest, a sound that vibrated through the ground and up through Lyra's boots and into her bones. But the animal made no move to lunge. It couldn't. The chains were wound so tight it could barely breathe, let alone attack. And then Lyra saw its eyes. They weren't the flat, predatory yellow she expected. They were amber, a vivid, striking amber that seemed to glow with their own internal light, and the intelligence in them was staggering. There was no feral madness in that gaze, no simple animal cunning. This creature was looking at her with the same kind of desperate, pleading awareness as a human being. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to run, to turn around, climb back up to the rim, and pretend she'd never seen this. Whatever this was, it was beyond her understanding, beyond the safe boundaries of the world she thought she knew. But she couldn't move, couldn't look away. Because in those amber eyes she saw something she recognized, something she'd seen in her own reflection every morning for 12 years. Suffering, exhaustion, and a rage so deep it had burned down to embers waiting for oxygen to roar back to life. "Oh my God," she whispered. The words were swallowed by the vast silence of the ravine. The wolf's eyes locked onto hers. The growling stopped. For a long moment, human and animal regarded each other across 50 feet of moss-covered stone and ancient fear. Then, the wolf made a sound that broke something in Lyra's chest. A sharp, high-pitched whine that sounded devastatingly, impossibly human in its misery. She took a step forward. Her rational mind was screaming. This was insane. This was how people died in the wilderness, approaching injured predators that could kill them with a single snap of those massive jaws. She should turn around, right now, hike back to the cabin, call someone, the sheriff, Fish and Wildlife, somebody who was trained for this. But who had done this? Who had the resources and the knowledge to capture an animal this size, to bind it with silver chains, worth thousands of dollars, to leave it here to die slowly in the bottom of a ravine that barely showed up on maps? Lyra's gaze moved from the wolf to the chains following their path. The main restraint, the thick chain that wrapped the animal's torso and connected to a heavy padlock at its chest, was formidable. Military-grade hardware, the kind of lock you'd need bolt cutters or a blowtorch to defeat. But the anchor chain, the length that secured the whole apparatus to the oak tree's roots, showed signs of stress. The heavy October rains had softened the ground, causing the massive root structure to shift. Where the silver chain rubbed against wet wood and stone, corrosion had set in. Not rust. Silver didn't rust. But some kind of chemical reaction with the minerals in the water, creating a greenish patina that weakened the metal. There was a weak point, one link about 8 feet from where the chain wrapped around the root, that looked compromised. A crack running through the metal, barely visible, but definitely there. "I'm going to help you," Lyra said. Her voice shook, but she said it anyway. Speaking the words made them real, made them a commitment she couldn't back away from. "Please don't kill me. Okay, please don't kill me." The wolf watched her, waited, as if it understood every word. Lyra's eyes swept the ravine floor, searching. There, a piece of granite roughly the size of a bowling ball, angular enough to provide impact force. It would take both hands to lift, but it was manageable. She approached the tree root, giving the wolf as wide a berth as the terrain allowed. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the rock twice. Adrenaline flooded her system, sharpening everything to painful clarity. She could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the wolf's scent, wold and musky and wrong, in a way she couldn't define, could feel the weight of those amber eyes tracking her every movement. The wolf shifted slightly, moving with obvious pain, giving her better access to the anchor point. The silver chain sizzled where it dug deeper into the flesh of its shoulder. The creature's breath came in short, agonized pants. It understood. It knew what she was trying to do. Lyra hefted the granite rock, feeling the rough stone scrape her palms even through her gloves. She positioned herself at the weak point into the chain, the corroded link that represented the only chance either of them had. She brought the rock down hard. Clang! The sound rang out sharp and violent in the cathedral quiet of the ravine. The wolf flinched but didn't pull away. Lyra struck again, and again. Her shoulders burned. Rain plastered her hair to her face. Her breath came in harsh gasps. The metal groaned. The crack widened. She lost count of how many times she brought the rock down. 10, 20. Her hands were numb. Her arms felt like they were on fire. But she couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. Because those amber eyes were watching her with something that looked dangerously like hope. Finally, with one desperate adrenaline-fueled blow, the corroded link shattered. The sound was like a gunshot. The tension released instantly. The chain unspooled from the root, whipping through the air, with lethal force missing Lyra's head by inches. The wolf was no longer anchored to the tree. Lyra scrambled backward, dropping the rock, her boots slipping on wet leaves. Her chest heaved. Okay, you're free. Whoa, run. But the wolf didn't run. It tried to stand, those massive legs pushing against the ground, muscles bunching under the black fur. It made it halfway upright before collapsing with a sound that was half yelp, half groan of pure agony. The silver chains still wrapped around its body, muzzle, and throat. The animal was free of the tree, but it was still a prisoner in its own skin. The metal was killing it, slowly, systematically, burning it from the outside in. The wolf looked up at Lyra again, and the desperation in those eyes was unbearable. She understood what it was asking, what it needed. "You have to let me touch you," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too calm for what she was about to attempt. "I have to get that padlock off." She knelt beside the massive creature. This close, the heat radiating from its body was intense, feverish. The wolf squeezed its eyes shut, its entire frame trembling violently, but it held perfectly still. Lyra's fingers found the padlock resting just under the wolf's jaw. It wasn't a keyed lock. It was a heavy-duty tension clasp designed to hold tight under pressure, but theoretically releasable if you could generate enough force against the mechanism. She wedged her thumbs against the release, gritting her teeth, putting all her weight and strength into it. The wolf let out a low whine as the shifting metals seared its skin. The smell of burning fur and flesh filled the air, acrid and nauseating. "Almost," Lyra grunted. "Almost. Stay with me." The clasp resisted. Her thumbs were going numb from the pressure. She could feel the metal cutting into her skin through her gloves. And then with a loud snick, it gave way. The heavy chains fell away from the wolf's muzzle and neck, clattering onto the rocky ground with a sound like breaking bones. The wolf didn't immediately move. It took one massive, shuddering breath, its chest expanding fully for the first time in God knew how long. Steam rose from where the silver had burned it, the wounds already starting to weep clear fluid. It shook its massive head, droplets of rain and blood flying. Then it looked at Lyra. The dynamics shifted in an instant. The pathetic, trapped creature was gone. In its place stood an apex predator, massive, lethal, and completely unbound. Lyra froze. The reality of what she'd just done crashed down on her with the weight of the mountains above. She was 15 feet from a wolf that probably weighed 200 pounds. A wolf that could crush her windpipe before she could scream. "Go on," she whispered. Her voice came out thin and reedy. "Shoo, go!" The wolf stood up, slowly, deliberately. Even injured, even burned, it towered over her. Those amber eyes burned into hers with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. It took one step toward her. Lyra began to back away. One step, two. Her heel caught on a root, and she stumbled, catching herself on a boulder. Every muscle in her body was coiled to run, even though she knew you should never run from a predator. The wolf didn't chase, it just stood there watching her with those impossible eyes. And then it began to change. It wasn't like the movies. There was no graceful morphing, no poetic moonlight transformation bathed in CGI. This was violent, visceral, the stuff of nightmares that would wake her gasping for years to come. The sound came first, a sickening symphony of bones breaking, not the clean snap of a fracture, but the wet crunch of an entire skeleton restructuring itself. The wolf's spine arched upward at an impossible angle, vertebrae popping like gunshots. Its limbs began to elongate, joints bending backward, then forward, then backward, and again, the sound echoing off the ravine walls like dry branches being fed into a wood chipper. Lyra screamed. She couldn't help it. The sound tore from her throat, raw and primal, and she stumbled backward, her hands flying to her mouth. But she couldn't look away. Horror and fascination held her paralyzed. The black fur was receding, not falling out, but being absorbed, pulled back into skin that was stretching, tearing, reforming. Olive-toned human skin appeared in patches, raw and slick, covered in a sheen that was part sweat, part something else. Muscle expanded and contracted in waves, building mass in some places, redistributing it in others. The snout was retracting with a wet crunching sound, the massive canine jaw compressing, reforming into something smaller, more human. Teeth ground against each other. The ears flattened, reshaped, moved down the sides of what was now becoming a human skull. The massive paws were the worst. Lyra watched in sick fascination as the bones of the wolf's front legs extended the paw pads, splitting and reforming into fingers and thumbs. Claws retracted into nail beds. The sound was like tearing canvas soaked in oil. The creature, because it was no longer wolf and not yet man, fell to its hands and knees during the process. It made sounds that were half animal growl, half human groan, a noise that belonged to neither world and both. The entire ordeal lasted maybe 20 seconds. To Lyra, it felt like watching 20 minutes of body horror compressed into a handful of heartbeats. When the cracking stopped, when the silence of the woods rushed back in, broken only by the distant roar of the waterfall and the rain dripping from the canopy, a man was kneeling on the damp earth where the wolf had been. He was stark naked. Steam rose from his skin in the cold air. He was massive, easily 6'4", built like someone who'd spent a lifetime doing physical labor. Broad shoulders, heavily muscled arms, a chest that tapered to a narrow waist. He was covered in mud pine needles and sweat. Angry red welts crisscrossed his neck, chest, and arms, burn marks where the silver chains had seared him. Some of them were still weeping the flesh beneath, raw and blistered. He stayed on his hands and knees for a long moment, his breath coming in deep, ragged gasps. Dark hair, wet from the rain, hung forward, obscuring his face. Lyra's brain couldn't process what her eyes had just witnessed. A wolf? A man? The same being? The same? She backed up another step. Her foot came down on loose gravel and she nearly fell again. The man pushed himself upright, slowly, unfolding his massive frame to its full height. The sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. He radiated a kind of raw, dangerous power that made the storm above seem tame by comparison. He brushed his wet hair back from his forehead with a trembling hand and looked straight at her. Lyra stopped breathing. They were the same eyes. The brilliant, intense amber eyes of the wolf now set in a strikingly rugged, deeply masculine human face. His jaw was strong, covered in several days of dark stubble that couldn't hide the sharp angles of bone beneath. His nose had a slight crook in it, as if it had been broken at least once. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, pale against tan skin. He didn't speak. He just stared at her with an intensity that felt like being seen through, like every wall she'd ever built was transparent to him. He inhaled deeply through his nose, his nostrils flaring, head tilting slightly, as if scenting the air around her. As if he could smell her fear, her confusion, the adrenaline flooding her system. A strange look crossed his face. Confusion, first his brow furrowing. Then something else. A dawning, devastating realization that seemed to hit him with almost physical force. The pupils of his amber eyes dilated until they were almost entirely black-ringed, only by a thin circle of that impossible gold. Lyra took another terrified step back. Her heel caught on a root, and she went down hard, landing on her backside in the mud. "Stay back," she warned. Her voice came out thin and ready. Nothing like the authority she'd intended. "I have bear spray. I'll use it." It was a lie. The bear spray was still clipped to her belt, but her hands were shaking so badly she'd never get it free in time. He ignored her completely. He moved toward her, and it was wrong. He didn't walk like a normal man. There was something in the way he moved, a predatory fluidity that belonged to the animal he'd just been. Silent, graceful despite his size, each step placed with deliberate care. "You," he said. His voice was incredibly deep, rough from disuse and pain, like gravel being tumbled in a mixer. The single word seemed to vibrate in Lyra's chest, resonating at a frequency that made her ribcage ache. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Before Lyra could even think to scramble away, he was right there, looming over her. The heat radiating from his bare skin was intense against the cold, damp air. He didn't attack. Instead, he knelt, bringing himself down to her level. He reached out one large, calloused hand, moving with surprising gentleness, and cupped the side of her face. His touch was shockingly tender, almost reverent, though his hand trembled slightly. His palm was hot against her cold, rain-dampened skin, feverish, with whatever metabolic fire had just transformed him. Lyra was too terrified to move. She stared up at him, wide-eyed, her entire body shaking. He leaned down slowly, bringing his face to the crook of her neck, right where her pulse hammered wildly under her skin. He inhaled deeply again, his nose brushing against her jawline. The stubble on his face scraped lightly against her throat. The sound he made was low, guttural. Not a growl, something else. A sound of pure, instinctual satisfaction that raised goosebumps along her arms. Lyra whimpered, expecting teeth, expecting pain. Instead, he pulled back just enough to look into her eyes again. His gaze was possessive, overwhelming, utterly terrifying in its absolute certainty. "Mine," he growled. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact delivered with the authority of a king staking claim to newly discovered territory. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with implications Lyra couldn't begin to understand. She felt something strange, a jolt deep in her stomach. Not fear, though there was plenty of that. This was different. An inexplicable pull like a fishhook snagging something vital inside her chest and tugging. Hard. "What?" she breathed. Her voice was barely a whisper. His thumb traced her cheekbone with surprising gentleness, wiping away a smudge of mud she hadn't realized was there. The intensity in his eyes didn't waver, didn't soften. "You freed me," he said. His voice was thicker now, rough, with something that sounded dangerously like desire. "You broke the silver, the binding. You are mine now, little mapper." How did he know she mapped? How could he possibly? He glanced over his shoulder toward the direction of the old logging road that cut through the deeper woods, the direction opposite Oakhaven. His expression hardened instantly, the possessive warmth in his face replaced by something cold and lethal. "We have to move," he stated abruptly. He dropped his hand from her face, though his gaze remained fixed on her. "They will know the chains are broken. The binding spell will have snapped. They'll be coming." "Who?" Lyra demanded. Her voice was rising toward panic. "Who's coming? What are you?" He looked back at her. A grim, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. It wasn't comforting. It was the smile of a predator who'd just remembered he had teeth. "Your destiny, Lyra Winters," he said, using a name she hadn't told him. "And right now, your only chance of survival." He reached out and grabbed her hand. His grip was ironclad, broking absolutely no argument. His skin was furnace hot against hers, the contact sending another one of those strange jolts through her nervous system. He pulled her to her feet effortlessly as if she weighed nothing. "Come," he commanded. "Run with me." And Lyra, who'd spent 12 years asking questions nobody wanted to answer, who'd built a life out of methodical observation and careful planning, found herself being dragged into the unknown by a naked man who'd been a wolf 60 seconds ago. The rational part of her brain was screaming, but a deeper, older part, the part that had broken those chains, the part that had looked into amber eyes and seen suffering that mirrored her own, that part went quiet and followed him into the forest. Lyra didn't run. She was dragged. The man who had been a wolf moved through the forest with a speed that defied human capability. While Lyra stumbled over slick roots and mud-slicked rocks gasping for air, he flowed over the terrain like water finding its path downhill. He was barefoot, stark naked and bleeding from the silver burns that covered his torso and arms. Yet he didn't even flinch as he hauled her up the steep embankment of the ravine. His hand was a vice around her wrist. Not painful, but absolutely inescapable. Lyra's boots scrabbled for purchase on wet stone, her free hand grasping at exposed roots to help pull herself upward. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning from the sudden exertion and the thin, cold air. "Stop!" she finally screamed. Her voice echoed off the ravine walls. I can't breathe." He stopped abruptly at the rim where the land leveled out into dense forest. They were deep in the tree line now, far from the trail Lyra had followed. The rain was coming down harder, turning the world into a gray blur that reduced visibility to maybe 30 feet. He turned to face her, and Lyra got her first real look at him standing still. Even injured, even naked and covered in mud and pine needles, he was the most physically imposing human being she'd ever seen. 6'4" at least, maybe more. His shoulders were broad enough that he had to turn slightly sideways to move between close-growing trees. Muscle layered his frame in a way that spoke of function over aesthetics. This wasn't a gym body. This was the build of someone who'd spent a lifetime using physical strength to survive. Rainwater streamed down his chest, washing away some of the blood from the chain wounds. The burns looked worse in the gray daylight. Angry red welts, some of them blistered, others weeping clear fluid. The worst were around his throat where the chains had been tightest. The skin there was raw, almost black in places. He should be in agony. He should be in shock. Instead, he stood there like a statue carved from granite. In fury, his amber eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, but found she couldn't. "They are hunting," he said. His voice was low, urgent. "If they find you here with my scent on you, they will kill you. Do you understand? You are compromised." "Who?" Lyra choked out. She wiped wet hair from her eyes with her free hand. "Who are they?" His jaw tightened. Caleb Thorne and his mercenaries. Before Lyra could ask who the hell Caleb Thorne was, a new sound cut through the white noise of the rain. Distant at first, but growing louder. A rhythmic thumping that she recognized immediately from countless search and rescue operations she'd followed on the news. Helicopter rotors, beating against the wind. The man's eyes, those piercing amber orbs, snapped toward the sound. His nostrils flared as he scented the air, head tilting slightly. "They're using thermal imaging," he growled. "Scanning the canopy. We're too exposed, too slow." Without asking permission, without any warning at all, he swept Lyra off her feet. She yelped in surprise as one of his arms hooked under her knees, the other around her back, lifting her as easily as if she were a child. She clutched at his shoulders instinctively, her fingers digging into hot, wet skin that felt like it was radiating heat from a forge. "Hold on," he commanded. Then he ran. If Lyra had thought he was fast before she'd been wrong, this was something else entirely. He sprinted through the dense undergrowth with power that felt more locomotive than human. He didn't stumble. He didn't slip. He vaulted over fallen logs without breaking stride, crashed through brake ferns that came up to his chest, his breathing heavy but rhythmic, controlled. Lyra buried her face in the crook of his neck to shield herself from the whipping branches. The smell of him filled her nose, rain and wild musk, and something else, something earthy and ancient that had no name in human language. His heart pounded against her side like a drum, fast but steady, the rhythm of a predator in full flight. For 20 minutes the world was nothing but motion, and the thunder of his heart, and the roar of rain, and the distant pursuing thump of helicopter blades. They finally broke through the dense forest onto a gravel road. Lyra recognized it immediately from her maps. Route 42, a defunct logging service road that hadn't been maintained since the timber bust in the 90s. It was barely more than 2 ruts in the earth, now choked with alder saplings and encroaching blackberry vines. He didn't stop at the road. He crossed it at a dead sprint and headed toward a structure Lyra had marked on her map, but never investigated a dilapidated corrugated metal equipment shed half buried in the hillside left to rot when the logging company went bankrupt. He kicked the rusted door open with one bare foot. The hinges screamed in protest metal, grinding against metal. He carried Lyra inside and into the gloom. The smell hit her first. Old grease and rust and decades of accumulated dust. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. The shed was maybe 20 by 30 feet, filled with the skeletal remains of machinery, a broken winch, piles of chain that had fused together with rust workbenches rotting into the concrete floor. He set her down gently on one of the workbenches, then immediately turned to slam the door shut. He shoved a heavy rusted locker in front of it, metal scraping against concrete, with a sound that set Lyra's teeth on edge. The locker had to weigh 300 pounds. He moved it like it was made of cardboard. "Safe," he murmured, leaning his forehead against the cold metal door. The muscles of his back heaved as he caught his breath. For now. For a moment, Lyra sat on the workbench, shivering violently. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the bone-deep chill of the Oregon rain and the sheer overwhelming shock of the last hour. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking, covered in mud and scratches she didn't remember getting. Her father's wax jacket was torn at the shoulder, the waterproofing compromised, so that water had seeped through to soak her shirt underneath. "You," she said. Her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely get the words out. "You're a werewolf." He turned slowly from the door. In the dim light filtering through rusted holes in the roof, he looked like something out of mythology. A fallen god. Scarred, powerful, dangerous. He looked at his hands, flexing the fingers as if testing their responsiveness. "We prefer shifter," he corrected, his voice raspy. "Or lichen. Werewolf implies a lack of control, a slave to the moon. I am fully in control, Lyra." The sound of her name in his mouth sent another one of those strange jolts through her chest. "How do you know my name? I didn't tell you my name." He walked toward her, not the predatory stalk from before, but he still moved with that unsettling fluid grace that marked him as other. "I can smell it on you," he said. "Your mail, your work, the ink on the maps you draw. Everything you touch carries your scent signature." Lyra Winters, 28 years old, wilderness cartographer, daughter of Robert Winters, surveyor. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning her shivering form with something that looked like concern. "You're hypothermic." "I'm fine," Lyra stammered, wrapping her arms around herself. I want to go home." "You can't go home." His voice dropped an octave, taking on a tone that brooked no argument. "You freed the Alpha of the Obsidian Pact from a binding ritual. By the laws of the First Treaty, you have inserted yourself into a succession war. Going home means leading them straight to you." "I don't understand any of those words," Lyra said. Her voice was rising toward hysteria. "Alpha, treaty, succession war. I just didn't want to watch an animal suffer." He stepped closer, placing his hands on the workbench on either side of her hips, effectively caging her in. He leaned down, bringing his face level with hers. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "I am Rowan Ashford," he said. The name carried weight, as if she should recognize it, as if it should mean something. "I am the king of the shifters in the Pacific Northwest. And because you broke the silver that bound me, because you shattered a ritual, That took 3 blood mages and a full moon to cast. You are now responsible for me." He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips for just a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. "And I am responsible for you." "I didn't ask for responsibility," Lyra whispered. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. "I just didn't want you to die." "And yet," Rowan murmured, reaching out to touch a wet lock of her hair, "you broke the seal. The magic in those chains doesn't just bind the body, Lyra. It binds the soul. When you shattered them, you created a debt. Life for life. Do you feel it?" Lyra wanted to deny it, wanted to scream at him that she felt nothing, that this was insane, that she needed to get back to the cabin and call the police and forget any of this had ever happened. But she couldn't, because she did feel it. That strange pull in her chest, like a compass needle finding north. A low thrumming in her veins that intensified whenever he got close. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, which was maybe the most terrifying part. It felt like recognition. Like something in her had been waiting for this moment without knowing what she was waiting for. "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied. Rowan's mouth curved into a small, dangerous smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You will." He turned away, moving to a pile of old tarps in the corner. He rummaged through them, his movements precise, despite the injuries he'd sustained. After a moment, he pulled out a moth-eaten flannel shirt probably left by a squatter years ago. He pulled it on. It was too tight across his massive shoulders, the fabric straining against his biceps, but it covered his nakedness. The flannel was faded red and black plaid, missing several buttons. It should have looked ridiculous. Instead, it made him look more dangerous, like a predator wearing human clothing as camouflage. "Who is Caleb Thorne?" Lyra asked. She needed to keep him talking, needed information that might help her make sense of the nightmare her Tuesday morning had become. Rowan's expression darkened. The amber in his eyes seemed to flare with inner light. "My second in command," he said, the words coming out like they were coated in poison. "My beta, the man I trusted with my life for 8 years. He clenched his fists, knuckles turning white. "He drugged my scotch at the autumn summit 3 weeks ago. Wolfsbane and silver nitrate enough to paralyze me, but not kill me. He had his men drag me to that ravine to Devil's Drop. They wrapped me in pure silver and chained me to that oak tree." Rowan walked to the small, grimy window, looking out at the rain. "He didn't just want me dead, Lyra. He wanted me to suffer. Wanted me to go mad from the silver poisoning so he could parade my insane beast in front of the Pack Council and claim I was unfit to rule. Then he'd take my territory, my pack, my throne." He looked back at her, and there was something raw in his expression, something vulnerable beneath the anger. "You ruined his plan, and for that he will tear this forest apart to find you." Lyra processed this, her mind struggling to keep up. 3 weeks? You were chained there for 3 weeks. 18 days, Rowan corrected. Pure silver burns slower than people think. It would have taken another week, maybe 2, for the madness to set in completely. Caleb was patient, methodical. "How are you even alive?" "We're hard to kill." He touched the burns on his neck, wincing slightly. "And the binding ritual kept me in human form, which slows the silver poisoning. If I'd been able to shift the accelerated metabolism, would have killed me in days." Outside, the rain hammered against the metal roof. The helicopter sound had faded, but Lyra didn't find that comforting. If anything, the silence was worse. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. Rowan turned from the window, his eyes meeting hers across the dim space. "We stay here until nightfall. Then we move. I have a safe house near the Columbia Gorge. Caleb won't expect me to go deeper into his territory. He'll think I'm running for the Canadian border." "That's hours away." "Not the way I drive," Rowan said. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I need to contact my enforcers, my loyal wolves. If Caleb moved against me, he's likely already moved against them too. I need to know who's still alive, who's compromised." He moved back toward her, and Lyra had to fight the urge to shrink away. "But first you need to warm up. Your core temperature is dropping. I can hear your heart working too hard to compensate." "How can you enhance senses?" he said simply. He reached out and took one of her hands in both of his. His skin was still furnace hot, the contact almost painful against her frozen fingers. "You're going into shock, adrenaline crash combined with hypothermia. Not a good combination." Before Lyra could protest, he'd pulled her off the workbench and guided her to a relatively dry corner where several old tarps had been piled. He sat down back against the wall and pulled her down beside him. "I'm not," she started. "Body heat," he said firmly. "Medical necessity, not a seduction. You can hate me after you're no longer at risk of dying." "Deal," Lyra wanted to argue. But another wave of shivers racked her body, so violent her vision blurred. Okay, she whispered. Rowan pulled her against his side, wrapping one powerful arm around her shoulders. The heat radiating from him was immediate and intense, seeping through her wet clothes and into her frozen skin. She found herself instinctively pressing closer, seeking warmth. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the rain. Lyra's shivers gradually subsided as her core temperature stabilized. Her heartbeat slowed from its panicked flutter to something closer to normal. Your father, Rowan said quietly. Robert Winters. He died at Devil's Drop 12 years ago. That's not a coincidence, is it? Lyra stiffened against him. How do you know about my father? The same way I knew you'd hike there on a Tuesday, Rowan said. Information is power, Lyra. In my world, knowing the territory includes knowing the people who move through it. Your Aunt Vivian is known to us. She supplies medicinal herbs to several packs in the region. And Robert Winters, he paused. Robert Winters was surveying pack lands when he died, mapping migration corridors, logging sites. Lyra pulled away from him, anger cutting through the fog of shock. Are you saying werewolves killed my father? I'm saying Devil's Drop is a ritual execution site for the Obsidian Pack, Rowan said carefully. Has been for 200 years. And if your father was in the wrong place at the wrong time, asking the wrong questions. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Lyra felt something crack inside her chest. 12 years. 12 years of being told it was an accident. A tragic slip on wet rocks. And all along it might have been murder. Who? She demanded. Her voice shook with rage she didn't know she was capable of. Who killed him? Rowan met her eyes. I don't know. 12 years ago, I was still in Alaska fighting territorial disputes in the Arctic. I didn't take the Obsidian Pack throne until 8 years ago. But Lyra, if your father was killed because he discovered something about pack business, about illegal operations, then the person who killed him is probably still out there, Lyra finished. And you think it's Caleb. Caleb has been running illegal logging operations on protected pack lands for at least a decade, Rowan said, selling timber to overseas buyers pocketing the money. I only discovered it 6 months ago, started building a case. That's why he moved against me now. I was getting too close to exposing him. Lyra's mind was racing. Her father had been a surveyor for the Department of Forestry. He would have been the perfect person to stumble across illegal logging, to document it, to report it. And if Caleb had been running those operations 12 years ago? I need to see Aunt Vivian, Lyra said suddenly. She might know something. She was close to Dad. If he found evidence, if he told anyone, it would have been her. Rowan studied her for a long moment. Eugene is 2 hours south. We'd have to pass through the heart of Caleb's controlled territory. It's a risk. Everything is a risk right now, Lyra said. She met his gaze steadily. But if there's a chance my father's death is connected to this, to you, to what happened today, then I need to know. I've spent 12 years with questions nobody would answer. I'm done being in the dark. Something shifted in Rowan's expression. Respect maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit. You're tougher than you look, little mapper, he said. Stop calling me that. Why, it's what you are. You map the unmappable, chart the wilderness, bring order to chaos. He smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. It's a compliment. Despite everything, despite the fear and the cold and the sheer insanity of her situation, Lyra felt her lips twitch toward a smile. The moment was shattered by a sound outside. Close. Too close. The crunch of boots on gravel. Rowan was on his feet, instantly moving to the window with predatory silence. He peered through a gap in the rusted metal, his body tense. 3 men, he breathed. Armed. Tactical gear. They're sweeping the road. Lyra's heart kicked back into overdrive. Caleb's people? Mercenaries. Rowan's voice was flat cold. Human hunters who work for the highest bidder. Caleb's been paying them for years. He turned to her, and the look in his eyes made her blood run cold. When I tell you to run, you run. You head west toward the Zigzag River. Follow it south until you hit the bridge at Rhododendron. There's a ranger station. Get inside, lock the doors. Don't come out until daylight. What about you? I'm going to make sure they don't follow. Before Lyra could argue, before she could point out that he was injured and unarmed and outnumbered, the door to the shed exploded inward. The locker Rowan had used as a barricade went flying as if it weighed nothing. 3 men in black tactical gear poured through the opening, assault rifles raised. Rowan didn't hesitate. He moved like lightning, closing the distance to the first mercenary before the man could bring his weapon to bear. Rowan grabbed the rifle barrel, twisting it upward. The gun discharged with a deafening crack, bullets shredding the ceiling, metal rained down. With a savage motion, Rowan headbutted the mercenary. The sound of the tactical helmet cracking was sickening. The man dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The second mercenary opened fire. Lyra screamed, diving behind the workbench. But Rowan had already grabbed the unconscious first mercenary by his tactical vest. He used the man's body as a shield, bullets thudding into Kevlar and flesh. Then he hurled the body at the second shooter. 200 pounds of dead weight slammed into the second mercenary, driving him backward into the third. They went down in a tangle of limbs and equipment. Rowan spun toward Lyra. Run now. But Lyra's eyes were locked on the door, on the figure standing just outside, silhouetted against the gray daylight. The man was tall and thin, wearing a tailored gray suit that looked absurd in the middle of the Oregon wilderness. His hair was pale blonde, slicked back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the cold, reptilian quality of his eyes. He was smiling. Rowan Ashford, the man said. His voice was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of mockery. Look at you, fighting like a common brawler. How the mighty have fallen. Caleb, Rowan growled. The subsonic rumble in his voice made Lyra's bones vibrate. Caleb Thorne stepped into the shed, stepping casually over the groaning mercenaries. You brought humans into pack business, you've broken the veil. I'm merely cleaning up a mess. His eyes, pale gray and utterly emotionless, shifted to Lyra. Come out, Miss Winters. I know you're there. I can smell the fear rolling off you. Lyra didn't move. Couldn't move. Come out, Caleb said again, his voice hardening, or I will order my men to fill your precious king with enough silver rounds to turn him into a statue. Slowly trembling, Lyra stood up from behind the workbench. Rowan's eyes blazed with fury. Stay back, Lyra. Ah, touching, Caleb mocked. The bond is already forming. Disgusting. A king brought low by a meat sack. He motioned to the two mercenaries who were struggling to their feet. Take her. The men moved toward Lyra, their rifles trained on Rowan to keep him from interfering. And Rowan Ashford Alpha, king of the Obsidian Pack, threw his head back and let out a sound that wasn't human. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a howl. It was a command, primal and absolute, a sound that seemed to bypass human ears and go straight into the brainstem. Kneel. The word wasn't spoken, it was roared, but it carried a subsonic frequency that hit the room like a shockwave. The air itself seemed to compress reality, bending around the sheer force of will behind that single word. The mercenaries clutched their heads, dropping to their knees instantly. Even Caleb stumbled, blood streaming from his nose, his face contorting with the effort of resisting. Rowan didn't waste the opportunity. He grabbed a heavy oak workbench and hurled it at the window beside the door. The old wood exploded through rusted metal, creating a shower of splinters and shrapnel. He sprinted to Lyra, grabbed her hand, and pulled her toward the makeshift exit. Jump, he yelled. He didn't give her a choice. He leaped through the opening, dragging her with him, and they fell into the gray, rain-soaked afternoon beyond. They hit the ground with bone-jarring force. Rowan took the brunt of the impact, rolling at the last second to absorb the shock, cradling Lyra against his chest, so she barely felt the landing. They tumbled down a short embankment, crashing through wet ferns and blackberry brambles that tore at their clothes and skin. He was up instantly, pulling her to her feet before she could catch her breath. The river. Run. Behind them, shouts erupted from the shed. The crack of gunfire split the air. Bullets kicked up dirt and shredded vegetation around them. Rowan dragged Lyra toward the tree line, his hand an iron vise around her wrist. She stumbled, her boots slipping on wet ground, but he kept her upright through sheer momentum. The forest swallowed them in seconds, the dense canopy providing cover from the shooters. To the river, Rowan commanded again, his voice tight with urgency. It will mask our scent. They crashed through rhododendrons, the thick, waxy leaves slapping against their faces. Lyra could hear pursuit behind them, boots pounding through undergrowth, men shouting coordinates to each other. Professional. Organized. Closing in. The ground began to slope downward sharply. Through the trees ahead, Lyra could hear the rushing roar of the sandy river, swollen with autumn rain and snowmelt from Mount Hood's glaciers. They broke through the last line of trees, and Lyra's heart sank. The riverbank was a steep, muddy drop of at least 15 feet down to the water, and the river itself was a churning monster, brown with silt, moving fast enough that white water foamed around exposed boulders. The current would be brutal. The water temperature, fed by glacial melt, would be barely above freezing. "No," Lyra gasped, pulling back against Rowan's grip. "We can't. That current will kill us." "They will kill us," Rowan countered. He pulled her to the edge. "The river won't. Trust me." "I don't." More gunfire erupted behind them. A bullet whined past Lyra's ear, so close she felt the air displacement. Rowan didn't wait for her consent. He wrapped one arm around her waist and jumped. The world tilted. Lyra's stomach lurched as they fell through empty air. Then the water hit like a fist made of ice. The cold was instantaneous and total. It drove the air from Lyra's lungs in an explosive gasp. The current grabbed them immediately, violent and indifferent, pulling them under. Water filled her nose, her mouth. She couldn't tell which way was up. Then Rowan's arm tightened around her waist like a steel band. He kicked powerfully and they broke the surface. Lyra gasped, coughing, her lungs burning. "Swim!" Rowan shouted over the roar of the river. "Let the current take us downstream." "Don't fight it." Lyra kicked weakly, trying to keep her head above water. The river was carrying them away at terrifying speed. The banks flashed by in a blur of green and brown. Boulders loomed out of the murky water with almost no warning. Rowan steered them around the worst obstacles, with one arm, the other still locked around Lyra's waist. The cold was already seeping into her bones. Her fingers were going numb. Her legs felt heavy, unresponsive. Hypothermia was setting in fast, much faster than before. She'd been wet and cold earlier, but this was different. This was full immersion in water that couldn't have been more than 40 degrees. "Rowan," she managed through chattering teeth. "Can't." "Stay with me," he commanded. His voice was strained but still strong. "We're almost to the bend. Hang on, Lyra. Just hang on." The river swept them around a curve. The current slowed slightly here where the channel widened. Rowan began kicking toward the eastern bank, fighting the water with powerful strokes. They drifted for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. Lyra's consciousness was starting to fragment, her vision tunneling. She was dimly aware of Rowan dragging them onto a gravel bar, of being lifted from the water of solid ground beneath her. Then nothing but cold and darkness. She came back to awareness in stages. First, she became aware of warmth. Heat pressed against her back, her front surrounding her. Then sensation returned to her extremities in waves of painful pins and needles. Her teeth were chattering so violently, her jaw ached. "That's it," Rowan's voice rumbled near her ear. "Come back. Stay with me, little mapper." Lyra's eyes fluttered open. She was in some kind of shelter, though calling it that was generous. They were tucked into the hollow of a massive upturned stump, the root system creating a cave-like space barely big enough for two people. Rain drummed on the exposed roots above them, and Rowan was wrapped around her front to back, his body heat radiating through her soaked clothes. "Don't sleep," he said quietly. His breath was warm against her neck. "I know you want to, but you need to stay awake for me." "Cold," Lyra managed. "I know, I'm warming you as fast as I can. Your core temperature dropped too far. Another few minutes in that river, and you wouldn't have made it." They lay there for hours as the storm continued to rage. Rowan's preternatural body heat slowly, methodically brought Lyra back from the edge of hypothermia. He talked to her the whole time, keeping her conscious, asking her questions that forced her brain to engage. "Tell me about your maps," he said at one point. "Why?" "Because I want to know. Because it keeps you awake. Tell me." So Lyra, teeth still chattering, told him about teaching herself cartography from her father's old field notes, about the satisfaction of turning chaos into order, of seeing patterns in terrain that others missed, about the 3-year project to map the Cascades, cross-referencing field measurements with weather data from NOAA broadcasts she monitored obsessively. "Your father would be proud," Rowan said quietly. Lyra felt something break loose in her chest. "You didn't know him." "No, but I know you, and I can see his legacy in everything you do." When Lyra finally stopped shivering, when her body temperature had stabilized enough that she wasn't at immediate risk, she realized her head was resting on Rowan's chest. The steady, powerful thrum of his heart beat against her ear. She should pull away, should put distance between them. But she was exhausted, wrung out, and his warmth was the only thing keeping the cold at bay. "We have to go to Eugene," she said into the growing darkness. "To Aunt Vivian." Rowan's chest rumbled with a sound that might have been agreement or resignation. "When the sun rises, moving at night in your condition would be suicide." "How far did we drift?" "Maybe 3 kilometers. We're near Oxbow Park if my sense of direction is right. We can hike to Gresham in the morning, find transportation from there." "Steal transportation, you mean?" "Commandeer," Rowan corrected. A hint of dark humor colored his voice. "I'm a king. Kings don't steal. We requisition." Despite everything, despite the fear and the cold and the sheer absurdity of her situation, Lyra felt her lips twitch. "That's not how the law works. Pack law is different." He shifted slightly, adjusting his position to better shield her from the rain that occasionally found its way through the root system. "By pack law, everything in my territory belongs to me. I'm simply reclaiming my property." "Whoopin, that's a dictatorship. That's survival." His voice grew more serious. The human world has the luxury of democracy, of voting and due process and checks and balances. The shifter world doesn't work that way. We're predators, Lyra. Pex predators who could tear through human civilization like paper if we chose. The only thing that keeps us in check is the alpha structure. Strong leaders who enforce the old laws, who maintain the veil between our world and yours. And the veil, Lyra repeated. Caleb mentioned that. What is it? The treaty between shifters and humans, Rowan explained. Signed in 1847 after the Pacific Northwest Territories opened to settlement. We agreed to remain hidden to let humans believe we were myths and legends. In exchange, they left our lands alone. The treaty has held for almost 200 years. And you think Caleb broke it by bringing human mercenaries into shifter business? Not just mercenaries, hunters. Men who know what we are, who've been trained to kill our kind. Rowan's arm tightened fractionally around her. That's a death sentence by pack law. He's desperate. Lyra was quiet for a moment, processing. He called you king. Are you actually royalty? Alpha king, Rowan corrected. There's a difference. Royalty is born. Alphas are made. I fought for my position. Defeated the previous alpha in single combat 8 years ago when he grew too old to lead effectively. That's how it works. Challenge and conquest. And Caleb wants to challenge you. Caleb wants to murder me and claim I went feral. It's different, less honorable, but more certain. He paused. If he'd simply challenged me to combat, I would have accepted. But he knew he couldn't beat me in a fair fight, so he poisoned me instead. Chained me with silver to make me weak, to drive me mad. Why Devil's Drop specifically? Rowan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was darker. It's a place of power for the Obsidian Pack. Ritual executions have been performed there for 2 centuries. The ground is soaked in blood, in death. It amplifies binding magic. Caleb didn't just chain me there. He tried to bind my wolf to trap the beast inside me until the silver poisoning forced a permanent transformation. A fate worse than death. But I broke it. You broke it, he confirmed, which should have been impossible. The binding ritual required 3 blood mages and a full moon to cast. Breaking it should have required the same. But you did it with a rock and sheer stubborn will. His hand moved almost unconsciously to trace the line of her arm. That's why the bond formed. Silver Breaker. The legends say that anyone who frees an alpha from silver chains becomes bound to them. Life for life. Fate for fate. Lyra's breath caught. Is that why I feel... She trailed off, not sure how to describe the magnetic pull, the sense of rightness when he touched her. Yes, Rowan said quietly. The bond. It will grow stronger over time if we don't fight it. Eventually, we'll be able to sense each other's emotions, share thoughts, know when the other is in danger. That sounds like a violation. It can be, if forced. His voice softened. But Lyra, I need you to understand something. The bond doesn't create feelings that aren't already there. It amplifies what exists. If you felt nothing for me, if I was just a monster who terrified you, the bond would feel like chains, like suffocation. And if I don't feel nothing, she felt his smile against her hair, then it feels like coming home. They fell into silence. Outside their shelter, the rain continued its relentless assault. Somewhere in the distance, a great horned owl called its deep hooting, cutting through the white noise of the storm. Your father, Rowan said eventually, when you found me, you said he died at Devil's Drop. That's why you hike there every Tuesday. It wasn't a question, but Lyra answered anyway. I told myself it was about maintaining the trail, about keeping my map current. But yeah, it was about him, about feeling close to him again. Grief is a kind of cartography too, Rowan said softly. Mapping the landscape of loss, finding new routes through familiar territory that's been forever changed. Lyra blinked back sudden tears. That's the most beautiful thing anyone's said to me in 12 years. Then you've been talking to the wrong people. As the night deepened and exhaustion finally pulled Lyra towards sleep, one thought crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. This morning she'd been alone. A woman defined by absence, no father, no mother, who cared, no sister who'd speak to her. She'd spent 12 years building walls around her grief, telling herself that solitude was strength, that needing no one meant no one could hurt her. But now wrapped in the arms of a man who'd been a wolf, who'd called her mine with absolute conviction, who jumped into a freezing river to save her from bullets, Lyra realized something terrifying. She wasn't alone anymore, and she wasn't sure if that was salvation or the beginning of a different kind of destruction. They left the shelter before dawn, when the rain had finally slowed to a persistent drizzle, and the sky had lightened to the color of old iron. Lyra's clothes were still damp, but Rowan's body heat through the night had kept her core temperature stable. She was stiff-sore and covered in bruises she didn't remember getting, but she was alive. They hiked in silence through the gray pre-dawn light. Rowan moved like a ghost despite his size, his bare feet somehow finding purchase on terrain that would have broken a normal person's ankles. The flannel shirt he wore was torn, now hanging off one shoulder, doing almost nothing to preserve his modesty. Lyra found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. The way he moved. The way he constantly scanned their surroundings, head tilting to catch sounds she couldn't hear, nostrils flaring to scent things she couldn't smell. Every few minutes, he'd stop, completely going utterly still, listening to the forest in a way that went beyond human capability. They reached the outskirts of Gresham just as the sun was breaking through the clouds. It was a small town on the eastern edge of the Portland metro area, the kind of place where people left their cars unlocked and everyone knew everyone else's business. Rowan led them to a trailhead parking lot. There was a single vehicle, a mud-splattered Subaru Outback with Oregon plates and a bumper sticker that read, "I'd rather be hiking." "Perfect," Rowan murmured. He approached the driver's side door. "That's stealing," Lyra hissed, looking around nervously for witnesses. "It's survival." He placed his palm flat against the lock mechanism. Lyra watched in fascination as he closed his eyes, his face tightening with concentration. There was a sound of metal groaning under stress. Then the lock popped up with a click. "How did you enhance strength, precise application of force?" He opened the door. "Get in." Lyra hesitated for only a second before climbing into the passenger seat. At this point, Grand Theft Auto seemed like the least of her problems. Rowan slid behind the wheel. He placed both hands on the steering column, that same look of concentration crossing his face. There was a crack of breaking plastic, then the sound of wires being stripped. The engine turned over with a cough. "Jesus Christ," Lyra muttered. "Where did you learn to hotwire cars?" "Alaska. Long winters. Not much else to do." He put the car in gear and pulled out of the parking lot. "We'll leave it somewhere visible in Eugene, M. The owner will get it back." They drove south, staying off I-5 and taking back roads that wound through the foothills. Rowan drove with aggressive precision, taking curves at speeds that made Lyra grip the door handle, but never losing control. "Tell me about Aunt Vivian," he said as they passed through the small town of Sandy. "What does she know about your father's death?" Lyra thought about it. She was devastated when he died. She and Dad were close, but she never questioned the official story, never suggested it was anything other than an accident. "Or she knew and was protecting you," Rowan said. "If she's connected to the shifter community, if she supplies herbs to the packs, then she knows how dangerous that knowledge can be." "You think she's been lying to me for 12 years? "I think she's been keeping you alive for 12 years. He glanced at her. "There's a difference." The drive took nearly 2 hours. They stopped once at a laundromat in Malala, where Rowan, with impressive audacity, simply walked up to a clothesline behind a house and took a pair of jeans and boots that looked roughly his size. "Now you're stealing clothes," Lyra said. "I'll send them money," Rowan replied, pulling on the jeans. They were a little short but fit well enough. The boots were construction Timberlands, worn but solid. "Once I have access to my accounts again, consider it a loan with generous interest." They reached Eugene just before noon. The city sat in a valley carved by the Willamette River, surrounded by forested hills. It was a college town home to the University of Oregon, with a population that leaned young and progressive. The Gilded Petal was located on a tree-lined street near the old downtown, a Victorian-style building painted sage green with gold trim. The windows displayed arrangements of seasonal flowers, chrysanthemums, ornamental kale, late-blooming roses. Rowan parked the stolen Subaru 3 blocks away. "Let me go in first," he said. "If Caleb's people are watching the shop, I'll know." "How can?" "I'll smell them." He opened his door. "Wait here, I'll signal if it's clear." He moved down the street with that predatory grace, scanning windows and doorways. After 5 minutes, he appeared in the shop window and gave a slight nod. Lyra got out of the car and walked to the shop, her heart pounding. She'd been to the Gilded Petal dozens of times over the years, but now seeing it through the lens of what Rowan had told her, everything looked different, sinister. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. The smell of flowers and soil and something else, something herbal and slightly medicinal, filled the air. Aunt Vivian stood behind the counter wearing her usual outfit of practical slacks and a cardigan. Her steel gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She looked up as Lyra entered, and her expression went through a rapid series of changes: surprise, relief, and then carefully controlled neutrality. "Lyra, dear," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. This is unexpected. Is it? Lyra asked. Her voice came out harder than she intended. Rowan stepped out from behind a display of potted ferns. He moved fast, crossing the distance to Vivian in 3 strides, and before the older woman could react, he had her pinned against the wall, one hand wrapped loosely but firmly around her throat. Give me one reason, Rowan said, his voice dropping to a growl that raised the hairs on Lyra's arms. Not to rip your throat out, Vivian Winters. Vivian didn't flinch, didn't struggle. She met Rowan's furious gaze with steel-gray eyes that held absolutely no fear. Because, she said calmly, if you kill me, you'll never find the blood oath ledger that proves Caleb Thorne is illegitimate. Rowan's hand tightened fractionally. Explain. Let me go and I will. After a long, tense moment, Rowan released her and stepped back, but his body language remained threatening, predatory. Vivian straightened her cardigan with dignified calm. She looked at Lyra, and for the first time her composure cracked slightly. Her steel-gray eyes, usually so composed, flickered with something that might have been relief. Or fear. You look terrible, dear. Lyra's voice came out harder than she intended. You knew about the shifters, about everything. You've known all along. Of course I knew. Vivian walked to the front door, locked it, and flipped the sign to closed. I was the pack archivist for the Cascadian territory for 30 years. I resigned 12 years ago. She turned back to them. The same day your father died. The words hung in the air like a blade about to fall. Lyra's voice came out barely above a whisper. Tell me everything. Vivian locked the shop door and gestured toward the back room. Come, what I have to show you isn't for prying eyes. The back room of the Gilded Petal was larger than Lyra had imagined. Beyond the work tables covered with flower clippings and ribbon was a heavy wooden door. Vivian pressed her palm against it, and Lyra heard a series of clicks, locks disengaging with a sound too mechanical for a simple flower shop. The door swung open to reveal a stone staircase descending into darkness. 12 years ago, Vivian began as they descended, her voice echoing off ancient stone walls. Your father discovered something he shouldn't have. Robert was surveying the western slopes for the Department of Forestry when he found clear-cutting operations on protected pack lands, 28 sites, millions of dollars in illegal timber sales. She reached the bottom and flipped a switch. Fluorescent lights flickered to life, revealing an archive that looked older than the building above. Stone walls lined with metal filing cabinets. A massive oak table in the center covered with yellowed maps and leather-bound ledgers. Robert did what he always did. Vivian continued, pulling a file from a locked cabinet. He documented everything. GPS coordinates, photographs, carbon dating of stumps. He brought the evidence to me because he knew somehow he'd always known that the pack existed, that I was connected. She spread Robert's original survey maps across the table. Lyra's breath caught, her father's handwriting, his precise notations, 28 red circles marking illegal logging sites. I begged him not to report it, Vivian said quietly. Told him the forestry department was compromised, that Caleb had people in every agency. But Robert believed in the system, in due process. He was going to file his report the Monday after he died. Caleb killed him, Lyra whispered. Caleb ordered it, but he didn't do it himself. Vivian pulled out another file. Inside were photographs. A man Lyra didn't recognize wearing a Department of Forestry uniform. Thomas Garrett, Beta Wolf Caleb's enforcer. He pushed your father off Devil's Drop and made it look like an accident. Rowan leaned over the table studying the evidence. Where is Garrett now? Dead, killed in a hunting accident 6 months after Robert died. Vivian's smile was grim. Caleb doesn't leave loose ends. I resigned the same day Robert was murdered because I knew if I stayed, I'd be next. I took everything I could carry from the archives, including this. She pulled out a leather-bound book, its cover embossed with symbols Lyra didn't recognize. The Blood Oath Ledger. Every Alpha succession for the past 2 centuries recorded with blood signatures that can't be forged. Caleb's lineage is in here, and it proves he's not eligible for the throne. Rowan opened the book carefully. His expression darkened as he read. He's not full-blooded. His mother was human. Which disqualifies him under the old laws, Vivian confirmed. He's been hiding it for decades. That's why he needed you, mad or dead Rowan. A formal challenge would require bloodline verification. But if you went feral, if you attacked your own pack, he could claim emergency succession without a genealogy review. The door at the top of the stairs banged open. Aunt Vivian, a woman's voice called. It's me. I got your message. Footsteps descended rapidly. A woman appeared at the bottom of the stairs, early 30s, dark hair like Lyra's, but with their mother's delicate features. Wren. Lyra's sister stopped dead when she saw them. Lyra, what are you? Her eyes moved to Rowan and her face went pale. Oh God, the king. You found him. You knew too, Lyra's voice cracked. All this time? Ren set down the laptop bag she was carrying. Not all of it, not until 3 months ago. She looked at Vivian. I worked for Cascade Timber Logistics. I thought I was just coordinating shipments. Then I found encrypted files on the company server. Shipping manifests that didn't match our official records. Payment transfers to offshore accounts. She pulled out a USB drive. I've been copying everything I could find. Bank records, emails between Caleb and the Council of Five, GPS coordinates of every illegal logging site active in the last 5 years. I was going to go to the FBI, but then Aunt Vivian contacted me last week. Told me about the pack, about what really happened to Dad. Ren turned to Lyra, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. When you kept saying Dad's death didn't make sense when you refused to move on, I thought you were being morbid. But you were right. You were always right. Lyra wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to the 5 years of silence, the abandonment. But looking at her sister's face, seeing the same grief and rage she'd carried alone for so long, she felt something break. Show me what you found, Lyra said quietly. They spent the next hour building the case. Robert's original maps, Ren's financial records showing $60 million in embezzled funds, Vivian's blood oath ledger proving Caleb's ineligibility, server logs showing Caleb had sold den coordinates to Hunter Cell's 47 pups killed over 5 years for profit. Rowan stood at the table, his hands braced on the oak surface, his expression carved from stone. This is enough to bring him down. But I need the council to see it, and I need witnesses who can't be silenced. The Autumn Equinox Summit, Vivian said. It's in 3 weeks at Timber Ridge Lodge. All 5 council alphas will be there, plus representatives from every pack in the Northwest. Caleb will have security, Rowan said. Mercenaries, loyalists. Then we get bigger authority. Vivian pulled out a satellite phone, old, heavy, clearly designed for one specific purpose. The Pacific Alliance, 7 Alpha Kings from California to Alaska. They can overrule the council, but they haven't convened in 40 years. Will they come, Lyra asked. Vivian smiled. For evidence of this magnitude, to prevent a civil war. Oh, they'll come. Elder Cale Northwood of Alaska owes me a favor from 1985. It's time to collect. Lyra and Rowan spent 2 weeks in the field resurveying her father's original 28 sites with updated equipment. Lyra mapped with precision that bordered on obsession, documenting every clear-cut, every destroyed migration corridor, every ton of stolen timber. Rowan provided security, but also learned. He watched Lyra work with quiet fascination, the way she read terrain, like language cross-referenced elevation with weather patterns turned chaos into comprehensible truth. They didn't talk about the bond, but it grew anyway. In the way Rowan asked before touching her, in the way Lyra stopped flinching when he came close. In shared tents during rainstorms in Lyra, or treating his silver burns with Vivian's salve and Rowan, teaching her to read wolf tracks in mud. On day 12, Lyra fell through rotted timber covering an old mine shaft. Rowan caught her wrist as she dangled over darkness, hauled her up with strength that should have terrified her, but didn't. I've got you, he said, always. And Lyra believed him. Vivian made the call. Elder Cale Northwood of Alaska, 82 years old, alpha of the Denali Pack, agreed to convene the alliance. 6 other kings confirmed: California, Washington, Idaho, Montana, British Columbia. The Pacific Alliance hadn't gathered since 1985. Their arrival would carry the weight of living law. They drove to Timber Ridge Lodge in a convoy: Rowan, Lyra, Ren, Vivian, and Tobias Crane, Rowan's loyal beta, who'd survived Caleb's purge. The lodge sat in the mountains of northern Oregon, massive timber and stone surrounded by old-growth forest. 200 wolves had gathered. Lyra could feel the weight of predatory attention as they entered. She was human. Prey. Every instinct in the room registered her as wrong. Wrong. Rowan's hand found hers, squeezed. You broke silver chains. You've earned the right to stand here. The Council of Five sat on a raised platform. Caleb in the center, flanked by the 4 regional alphas, Garrett Stone Miles, Donovan Morgan Vale, Jared Hunt. Then the alliance entered. 7 kings, gray-haired and ancient, carrying authority that made the council look like children playing at power. Cale Northwood's voice filled the hall. We are convened. Rowan Ashford petitions for justice. The council will answer. The trial unfolded with brutal precision. Evidence presentation: Rowan displayed Robert's maps on massive screens. 28 sites. GPS coordinates. Before and after satellite imagery showing systematic destruction. 923 acres of protected migration corridors, destroyed for profit. Financial records. Wren presented spreadsheets documenting 60 million in embezzled funds. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Shell companies routing money from Chinese timber buyers through Cascade Timber Logistics to Caleb's personal holdings. Blood Oath Ledger. Vivian stood before the Alliance opened the ancient book. Caleb Thorne's mother was human. He is half-blood. Under Article 7 of the old laws, he is ineligible for alpha succession. The hall erupted. Gasps, snarls. Caleb's face contorted with rage. Lies, he shouted. Forge documents from a disgraced archivist and then submit to genealogy verification, Kale said calmly. Blood test. Here. Now. Caleb's silence was damning. Witness testimony. Lyra walked to the center of the hall. 200 predatory eyes tracked her. She'd never been more terrified or more certain. My name is Lyra Winters. 12 years ago, Caleb Thorne murdered my father because he discovered the illegal logging operation. Robert Winters was a surveyor. He believed in truth, in documentation, in systems that work. She held up her father's original field notebook, hands shaking but voice steady. This is his evidence. 28 sites, GPS coordinates accurate to within 3 meters. I've resurveyed every location. The damage is worse now, because Caleb has spent 12 years destroying packlands for profit. A woman stood in the crowd, mid-40s, gray-streaked, hair, eyes red from old grief. My daughter died at Willow Creek. She was 4 years old. Council sold our den coordinates for $52,000. Another stood, then another. Parents of the 47 pups killed when Caleb sold den locations to hunters. Their testimony built like a wave grief, transforming into fury into demand for justice. Council fractures. Morganvale stood. I didn't know about the den sales. If this is true, I resign from council effective immediately. Jared Hunt followed. I voted for timber contracts Caleb said were legal. If I aided murder, I will accept punishment. Only Garrett Stone and Miles Donovan remained with Caleb, and even they looked uncertain. Alliance deliberation. The 7 kings conferred for 3 minutes. Then Kyle spoke. Guilty. Caleb Thorne, 48 murders, including Robert Winters and 47 pups. Embezzlement. Treason against pack law. Sentence exile beyond the Arctic Circle, life term, pure silver tracker, permanently implanted. Garrett Stone, Miles Donovan, conspiracy embezzlement. 20 years imprisonment, rank stripped, territories redistributed. Morganvale, Jared Hunt, negligent complicity. 10 years probation. Rowan Ashford, exonerated, rank restored, granted Northern Territories. Cale's eyes found Lyra. Lyra Winters, you are hereby appointed Alliance Surveyor. First human to hold official rank in pack governance. Your father's maps will be archived as permanent evidence. Your continued work will ensure this never happens again. The hall fell silent. Then one by one wolves began to howl, not in challenge, in acknowledgement. Injustice finally served. 4 months later. The Columbia Gorge Pack House was nothing like the old council compound. Rowan had designed it himself, sustainable timber, solar power, built to complement the forest rather than dominate it. Lyra's cartography office took up the entire south wing, wall-to-wall topographic maps, state-of-the-art surveying equipment funded by the Alliance. A team of 6 human assistants she was training in wilderness documentation. She stood at the window, watching dawn break over the gorge. Behind her, footsteps approached with that distinctive silent grace. Rowan's arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. Morning, little mapper. Morning, Your Majesty. She leaned into him, still marveling that this them felt so natural now. Alliance wants you to map the entire Pacific Northwest. 51,000 square miles. 3 years minimum. You'll need security. His voice held humor. I'm volunteering. You're the king. You have responsibilities. My responsibility is ensuring packlands are protected. You're the only one who can map them properly. He turned her in his arms. Besides, I follow no one else. Lyra smiled. 4 months ago, she'd been alone. Defined by absence, by grief, by walls she'd built to keep the world out. Now she had a sister who called every week working with the FBI to dismantle remaining corruption in timber agencies. An aunt who'd sacrificed everything to protect her. A mate who looked at her like she'd hung the stars. And purpose. God, she had purpose. I love you, she said. Simple. True. Rowan's amber eyes blazed. I love you, my queen, my choice. He kissed her, not desperate, not possession, but partnership. Promise. When he pulled back, he reached into his pocket. I had this made. He opened a small box. Inside was a ring, not traditional gold or diamond, but meteorite iron and raw emerald. Iron for your strength, emerald because you see truth in the wilderness. Lyra's breath caught. Rowan, marry me. Human way, pack way, any way you want. Just say you'll stand with me. Equals, partners, mates. She didn't hesitate. Yes, the wedding took place at Devil's Drop. Lyra had insisted. The place where her father died, where Rowan had been chained, where she'd made the choice that changed everything. But now it was different. They'd built a memorial there, stone and steel, engraved with the names of Robert Winters and the 47 pups. Justice remembers, it read. Lyra stood in a simple white dress, bare feet on moss-covered stone. Wren stood as her maid of honor. Vivian officiated, invoking both human vows and pack law. When Rowan bit her neck, gentle claiming, marking the bond that had been growing for months, snapped fully into place. She could feel his emotions like her own, his love, his pride, his absolute certainty that they were meant for this. As the pack howled their approval and Wren cried happy tears and the sun broke through the Oregon clouds, Lyra thought about cartography. Her father had taught her that maps show truth, where land is damaged, where it can heal. She thought she was mapping wilderness, but she'd been mapping something else entirely. The route from loneliness to belonging, from grief to purpose, from broken to whole. Power didn't always roar. Sometimes it was a woman with a rock breaking chains. Sometimes it was choosing to trust when trust had been stolen. Sometimes it was standing in the place where your father died and saying, this is not where the story ends. This is where it transforms. Rowan pulled her close. Ready to map the world, Mrs. Ashford? Lyra smiled against his chest. I already started.